You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 156. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. How often do you find yourself feeling trapped by a decision? This comes up so often with the lawyers that I work with, and there are so many ways that you may be describing this. It may be that you're calling it analysis paralysis. You may be sitting on the fence. You may have one foot in and one foot out. Regardless of how you describe it, it tends to have this characteristic of feeling trapped, of feeling stuck, of feeling unable to move forward with one decision or another. And the reason that I want to talk about it today is that it comes up so often in my coaching conversations with lawyers, and I would love to offer you a different way of looking at decisions that will help you move forward. And the way we're going to talk about it today is to look at this notion of bad decisions, these so-called bad decisions. You might imagine them having quotation marks around them, the word bad, because bad is subjective. We're going to get into that. And what I'd love to do is help free you from the fear that you will make a bad decision. So to do that, we're going to talk a little bit about decisions and what we consider to be bad decisions and how thinking decisions are bad or can be bad influences the way that you operate. Then I'm going to offer you some very specific strategies that you can use to help you unlock this idea of there being bad decisions in a way that will give you freedom to move forward and make more decisions. So let's dive in to today's episode, starting with this idea of bad decisions and how it can impact you in your practice. So first of all, there are two ways that I see this bad decision problem show up for lawyers. Now, the first way is when you've made a decision in the past and you choose to look at that decision as being a bad decision. So you might, for example, think about a job transition that you made in the past where you went from job A to job B. Job A was fine. You were okay there, but there were a number of problems with that particular role. And you decided that the best way to deal with those problems was to move somewhere else. So you go into job B, and maybe within a few weeks, maybe it takes a few years, you realize that actually job B is not that much better or any better than job A. There are perhaps a different set of problems, or maybe the same problems show themselves again. And so then you start to question the decision that you made to transition in the first place. Another way this might show up is, for example, if you have a decision ahead of you that you want to make, and you think to yourself that there are good decisions and bad decisions, and you're so concerned about making a bad decision that instead of making any decision at all, you stay where you are. You choose not to make decisions. So you can see how in both of these examples, the idea that there's a bad decision that is even possible is either keeping you focused on the past and beating yourself up and ruminating over a past decision and perhaps feeling fearful of making another one because you've now labeled yourself as having made a bad decision. Or you can see how fearing a bad decision in the future may keep you from making any decisions right now about what you're going to do moving forward. So what I would love to do is dive even deeper into this concept to really get a handle on what's going on for you in those different situations. So let's focus on that first example. Now, it doesn't have to be a job transition. It could be a project that you took on at work. Maybe somebody came to you and they said, you know what, there's this really great file It's a new client. We've never worked with them before. It's going to be a little bit different from what you're used to, but I think you're really going to learn from it, to grow from it, etc. So you say yes to the file, and next thing you know, the file has taken over your life. Maybe the client is really demanding. It's an area of law that's outside of your usual practice area. You're finding that you have to prioritize it over your other files, and things are getting really imbalanced. And you may be telling yourself, I never should have said yes in the first place, right? You're looking at this as a bad decision. It could also be that there is a decision in the future that you need to make. Maybe you have an employee that you work with. Maybe you've got an assistant or a paralegal or a junior lawyer who you've been working with, and that relationship is not working out the way that you had hoped it would. Maybe they're not able to provide work at the quality level that you need. Maybe they're not responsive in the way that you want them to be responsive. Maybe they don't seem interested in the work that you're doing. And so you're having a number of concerns. I mean, this could be a backward-looking problem in the sense of, maybe I never should have brought this person onto my team in the first place. Maybe that can be the so-called bad decision. Or you may be trying to avoid a bad decision in the future, right? Do I let this person go? What would be the consequences that could flow from that, right? So you're looking at the potential for bad decisions, and those could be either behind you or ahead of you. Now, when you are looking at a decision, and let's say it's a past-facing decision, and you've decided that that decision was a bad decision, then you would want to notice the story that you're telling yourself about the decision. And this is really impactful because the way that we describe the events that have happened in our life have a huge impact on the way that we see ourselves and the power that we can create for ourselves, not only in the way that we look at our past, but also how we choose to move forward. So let's say you were in a job and you stayed in that job for too long and things started to go sideways and maybe they didn't end very well for you. And you might look at that situation and tell yourself that, you know what, this was a big mistake. You might feel a lot of shame for having made a bad decision, which in that case maybe was making no decision. And so you might tell yourself you should have trusted your gut. You should have known better. You knew it was only a matter of time. There were all these red flags and you chose to ignore them. So you can see how that internal narrative is one that really puts a lot of blame on you for having made a bad decision. Now, it could also be that you made a choice. Let's go back to that file example. You chose to take on that file and it turned out to be one that you regret having taken on. Again, maybe you might be telling yourself, you know what? It seemed too good to be true. You should have known better. There are all sorts of stories that you can tell yourself. So when you use that type of language with yourself, then you'll notice how you feel, right? When you tell yourself that you should have known better, that there were red flags, you should have seen them, you might feel really embarrassed that you ignored them or didn't really appreciate them. You might feel frustrated that you saw them or you saw the potential problems and you moved forward anyways. You might feel ashamed from that belief that you really should have known better. You might feel powerless, that you were kind of a victim here, right? You didn't really assert yourself. You didn't really ask the questions that you needed to ask, that other people somehow made this happen and you kind of went along with it. You might also feel like you don't have very many good options that are available to you. And so what happens when you feel that way, when you feel embarrassed and frustrated or even ashamed, instead of moving forward with fresh decisions, you might find that you start to second guess your ability to make decisions in the first place. You might find that you avoid making decisions. Maybe you ask somebody else to make decisions for you. Maybe you go opinion shopping so that other people can give you their opinions and then maybe you purchase whichever decision seems most right to you. You may also find that you make a decision, but then you live in this zone of second guessing yourself. So you've made the decision, you've done some action, sent an email, told someone a conclusion, whatever that looks like, but then you start second guessing it because you don't see yourself as someone who's really good at making decisions. And then as a result, you can feel stuck. You feel afraid to make decisions. You might live with a lot of regret over past decisions. You may find that you ruminate a lot. You tell yourself a convincing story that you make bad decisions, or maybe that you are a coward because you don't make decisions. And what this can lead to is to undermine the trust that you have with yourself. So we've really gone deep into this idea of what flows from that initial belief that there are bad decisions that exist and that you are a person that perhaps makes bad decisions. So with that being one of the problematic situations that can arise, or how you can really look at that at the layers of, what's happening around you, how you're thinking about it, how you feel about it, the actions that you take as a result, you can see how that can be problematic. And why is this even a problem in the first place? How is it that we get so stuck on decisions? And there are really three problems that I see, or reasons why this happens. And number one is this idea that we as humans crave certainty. And I would argue that for lawyers, that need for certainty may be greater than for the general public. I think as lawyers, we are trained to look at situations and forecast every potential obstacle and be expected to know every nuance of the law, right? And what we want is to create certainty for our clients, and we also want to create certainty for ourselves. And the difficulty here is that certainty does not exist, right? And certainty or wanting certainty can lead us to make choices that may not overall be the choices that will move us in the direction that we want. So if you put yourself in that position where, let's say, you're in a job that you're not in love with, there's comfort in staying where you are, right? There's comfort in making no decision at all, because you may feel certain that even if you don't love where you are, there's certainty. There's certainty about who you'll be working with tomorrow. There's certainty that your compensation will be at a certain level. There's certainty that there will be a certain type of client, a certain type of work, and you feel like maybe it's not ideal, but you can live with it. You know what the outcome is going to be, more or less, day after day, week after week. And when you compare that to doing something completely different, the completely different might be so overwhelming that you go back to that certainty. You may have heard that expression, you're better off with the devil you know. And so that may be informing a lot of decisions that you are making or not making. Now, there's also this idea that if you prepare enough, right? This idea that if you line up all of your ducks, you can create certainty and remove the risk from any decisions that you make. And 100%, I would encourage you to do your due diligence before making a decision. But this can be problematic in your decision making, because let's say you make a decision and then something goes wrong. It doesn't turn out the way that you expected. Then what you might start to think is that this was your fault, that you must have missed a duck. So that certainty and that craving for certainty is one of the reasons why we put that label on decisions, and how that label and that craving or that need for certainty is keeping you from making decisions at all. Now, another reason why this might exist is that hindsight is 20/20. So when we make a decision, we don't know at that point in time what is going to flow from that decision, good and bad, right? I am sure you can think of examples right now where you've made a decision and there were some unexpected, not so great consequences. And I invite you to also think of examples where you made a decision and all of a sudden doors started to open for you in a very positive way that you never could have anticipated from that original decision. So when we look at our decisions and we're looking at them with 20/20 hindsight, it's really easy to apply a label of a good decision or a bad decision. You might say that was the best decision I ever made in my life, or that was the worst decision I ever made in my life, because now you've got the benefit of hindsight. But when you're in the position of making the decision, when you're at the other side of it, you don't have that perfect 20/20 hindsight vision. You're making decisions based on the information that you have at the time, using your best judgment. And so we don't want to start blaming ourselves or rewriting history and going from being someone who was a perfectly good decision maker to somebody who made the worst decision in the history of the world. Now, the third reason why this can become problematic is that you may find that you start to compound, or there is a compounding effect on a bad decision. So let's say that you make a decision that turns out to be what we might call a bad decision. There may be an unwillingness to move on from that decision, which means that you might make that decision even worse, right? So, for example, this might cause you to hyper focus on details that may or may not be truly relevant, and then you lose sight of the forest from the trees. So the closest example I could think of here was when you're in conversation with somebody and you say the wrong thing, right? The words come out of your mouth, you stick your foot in your mouth, you're embarrassed, and so you apologize and you move on, but you can't let it go, right? You keep going back. I'm so sorry I said that thing. And 10 minutes later, that thing I said, it was so awful. I'm so embarrassed. I never should have said that. And so because you're not able to let go of that bad decision, right? Again, we're calling that a bad decision. Maybe it wasn't a bad decision. Maybe there's some benefit to it, but here it is. We're calling it a bad decision. And so we keep going back trying to fix it. And so we're putting more energy into this original decision. And instead of moving forward and building something new, we're kind of stuck, right? We're stuck in the past. We're stuck trying to fix this thing that maybe we've done as much as we need to do to fix it. Now, another way this can show up, and this shows up quite a bit in situations where you're in a job, for example, and you've been there for a number of years and you're worried about moving on. It can come up in relationships that you have with colleagues, whether they're people that you work for or they're people that work for you. This idea of being unwilling to lose any sunk costs, right? So instead of being able to say, this relationship was great for what it was, and now it's time to move forward, you may find that you're so attached to that relationship that you don't want to let it go. So instead of moving forward, and maybe it is an employment situation, somebody who works for you, somebody that you work for, and it's no longer a good fit, instead of just accepting that and moving forward, you might find you're trying to fix it and you try to fix it, and it's just not something that needs to be done. So you can see how labeling decisions as good and bad decisions, how attaching yourself to trying to make decisions into good decisions, even if they're initially bad decisions, how you can get stuck, right? How these things can really tie you down and keep you stuck. And, going back to the title of this episode, what I would love to help you find is freedom. Freedom from seeing decisions as good as bad, freedom from letting these decisions dominate you from that perspective of fear of not wanting to make a bad decision or feeling like you have to justify or fix a so-called bad decision or be prevented from moving forward with new decisions. So what you may find that you are trying to do, right? If you find yourself in this position where you've got a decision that you've made and you regret it, or you have one that you've got to make in the future and it's hard for you to do, especially if you see yourself as a bad decision maker, is you may find that you overthink, you ruminate, you might look at your options and only see the negative, only see the possibilities of how these decisions, right? Because chances are there's different routes possible, are all negative. You might avoid making decisions altogether. You might delegate your authority, get someone else to make that decision for you. You might make the decision and then second guess yourself and beat yourself up over decisions that you've made. Or you might even be beating yourself up because you're not able to make a decision, and none of them feels very good. And none of them will help you get better at making decisions. And labeling the decisions as either good decisions or bad decisions in itself is inherently faulty because there's always going to be a little bit of both. So what can happen is when you've got these labels, when you've got these fears, when you're frozen in decision, what you might find is that you are avoiding decisions, or you may even make them in a haste. Now, arguably, you're better off making a decision in haste than no decision at all. But if you find you're so worried about making a decision, you might avoid that process. You might really procrastinate it and push it off. You might find you don't want to engage with the decision, and so you don't get the information that you need, and you end up having almost like a knee-jerk reaction because you just tell yourself, well, I have to decide one way or the other. So you do a knee-jerk reaction and just make a decision. You might think about how you would relate to a decision if that decision was a person. So you can think about a difficult choice that maybe you need to make. And if that decision was a person, how are you engaging with that person, right? Are you looking at them from a place of curiosity? Are you looking at them with a lot of skepticism? Are you afraid of them? Are you trying to spend more time with them? Are you pushing them into the corner because you want to avoid them? So you might think about how your relationship with your decisions, if they were relationships with people, how you would describe those relationships and what kind of results you're creating, what kind of relationship and outcomes you're creating with both that person and then by proxy, the decision that you have. Other things that can happen is you might find that your confidence starts to drop. You might start lowering or finding that your levels of self-trust go down. And you might also find that you lose touch of your intuition. For all of us, I think intuition is a really important player when it comes to decision making. We don't often put that at the top of our list when it comes to decision making. I think we often start with the logics and the facts and the data and the lists of pros and cons, etc. And if you find that you're making decisions and not listening to your instincts, not listening to your gut, that you may start to really lose touch with your gut instinct. And so that's something that I would want you to look at, right? How much are you able to access that inner sense of what you know to be the right decision for you? And what's your relationship with that? So I promised that I'd offer some solutions here, and I'm going to make good on that promise. I've got 4 different strategies for you. So we're just going to go through those. And I'm hoping that as we do that, you will think about decisions that you've got, whether they're past decisions that you want to reframe or future decisions that you want to tackle with greater confidence, with the freedom of being able to make those decisions without feeling like one of them is a bad decision. And so I'm going to take you through those right now. So the question being, how do you free yourself from bad decisions? So the first is to stop telling yourself that there is such thing as good and bad decisions. When you look at a decision, it is usually a choice. And I would say that for the most part, there are going to be 3 different roads that you can travel. The first road is the road where you make no decision. That in itself is a decision. So if you go to an example of somebody that you work with, right? Maybe it's an employee and you're trying to decide, do I continue to work with this person or not? Do I need to let them go? Do I need to ask to be reassigned? Whatever that looks like in the situation that you are in. One way to make a decision is simply to make no decision at all. There's a problem as you see it, but you've decided to just leave it. So that's one option. You can also look at that in the context of maybe you're in a job that you don't love. One decision that you could make is to simply stay and maintain the status quo. Another option for you is to decide to change your situation for the better by doing the work mostly on yourself, right? This means, for example, you could stay in that role with the person, for example, that you're working with and maybe adjust your expectations, maybe find ways that you could work differently with that person. It may be that you have a conversation with that person to try to make it better, right? Whether it's the person that you maybe are delegating to and you want to have a chat about your expectations and what you need from them moving forward. If you're in a job, for example, and you've decided to stay in that job, it might mean figuring out how to set better boundaries. It might be asking for a raise. It might be seeking out better work. It might be trying to make your environment more social. It might be finding mentors within your organization. So there's lots of ways that you can stay in your situation and you're not maintaining the status quo. You're not staying there without making any changes. You're staying there, but with a plan to make it better. And so that would be option B. So you've got option A is to do nothing. Right? The decision is no decision. Option B is you're going to stay where you are. You're going to maintain the current path, but you're going to make some significant changes. And then the third would be to change the situation altogether. This is where you decide that you're going to leave the job, for example, and start your own firm. It means you're no longer going to work with the person you've been working with. You're going to find a way to remove yourself or remove that person, depending on the nature of where you are. And so you're going to start fresh. So again, just looking at the decisions that you have, and you might run this model through any decisions that you are making. Stay where you are, change what you can about the situation, or leave that situation, create a new situation altogether. Now, regardless of which of these options you pick, there's always going to be a cost. And you might think about this, right? There's always going to be the price that you pay for making a decision. There's always going to be the road not taken. There's going to be the opportunity cost, right? Time that you spend on option A, for example, is time that you're not spending on option C, right? And so there's always going to be some sort of a cost to you. And I'd also invite you to think about the idea that you could say that even judges make what we might consider to be bad decisions. I don't want to speak disrespectfully. That's not at all my intention. But what I do want to highlight is that in a court system, if I look at the Canadian system, for example, we have 3 levels, right? We have the trial level, we have the Court of Appeal, and we have the Supreme Court of Canada. And what you will find is that very intelligent people who are making decisions based on cases that have been heavily researched and presented by talented counsel, that they are going to have differing opinions, right? And anyone who litigates knows just how much work and attention and detail goes into preparing a submission, the level of scrutiny of the facts, the level of understanding of the law, the way that you explain it, the way that you analyze it. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of hours go into preparing for these decisions to be made. And even with those resources invested, judges can make decisions that other judges may not agree with. And so to hold yourself to this standard that your decisions must always be correct, that there is a right and a wrong decision, that there is a good and a bad decision, is placing a standard on decisions that I would offer may be unrealistic. And so if you are trying to tell yourself that, there is no such thing as a right or a wrong decision, there are simply different choices, then that can really help free you up from this idea that you don't want to make a bad decision. Now, this isn't to say that you can't look at decisions and do your due diligence and approach your decisions with a certain level of research and identifying what's important to you and weighing the pros and cons. Absolutely. But let's take off that label of there being decisions that are inherently good and ones that are inherently bad. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to start looking for all of the reasons why a decision is a good decision. Now, this is particularly helpful if you're looking at a past decision, because you may have been telling yourself a story that the decision that you made was actually not very good. And what you might find is that if you change the way that you tell the story, then you might start to see how that was in fact a really good decision that you made. So maybe you've been at a job for a few years now where you are really feeling stuck, really feeling trapped. You want to move on. And I have so many lawyers who reach out to me who are in this exact position, right? It's like you've been sitting there, you've been struggling, you want to go, but life events are keeping you from leaving, work events are keeping you from leaving, and there's this gnawing feeling in the pit of your stomach that you need to make a move, and yet you don't make that move, right? There's something that's holding you back. So on the one hand, you might be telling yourself, I'm so indecisive. I've been telling myself for years I was going to do something about this, and here I am. That might be the story that you're telling yourself. Or you might also be saying, I've made a conscious choice not to make a move. The reason this has been the right way for me to proceed is that I have had this great opportunity where I've got this reasonably secure and steady place of employment where I continue to learn, I'm building relationships, and I'm able to figure out in a very measured way what I need to do next to create my next opportunity. I have time to build relationships. I have time to investigate. Maybe I'm learning skills about how I would love to practice, and maybe I'm learning skills about how I would not love to practice. And throughout this period, you are being compensated for the work and the value that you're contributing to your clients and to your organization. So you might see how actually this was a really good decision. And you might also ask yourself, when you do make a decision, right? Let's say you decide to leave, and what you often hear is somebody will go from job A to job B and they'll say, I wish I had made that decision sooner. Okay, so maybe that's a lesson, right? If you do make a decision, you say, what I learned was that I stayed too long in this particular role, or I waited too long to have a conversation with my boss or that paralegal or the junior lawyer that I've been working with. I waited too long. I stayed too long. You might ask yourself, where else in your work, where else outside of work are you doing the same thing? Where else are you waiting too long, where maybe you want to speed that pace up a little bit? It might also be that you look at a decision or you look at a lesson learned from a decision that you made or didn't make is maybe I accepted their judgment over my own. So maybe you decided that you didn't want to make a decision, right? You decided that it was too big of a decision. You didn't want to take the risk of making the wrong one. So you let somebody else make the decision. And effectively, you accepted their judgment over your judgment. And so if that's something that you're noticing as a lesson, well, where else might that be happening right now? Where else might you be deferring to other people who maybe you see as having authority where you actually have that authority? And what if you were to step in and start making decisions? Now, you might also have a situation where you have an inkling that maybe you should have said something, but you chose not to say anything. You dismissed that inkling. You decided it wasn't important. You might ask yourself, moving forward, where else might you be dismissing your intuition? Where else are you ignoring those nudges? And what would happen if you started to listen to them? Now, another question that you can ask yourself is, how is this the perfect decision given where you are right now? So if you're looking in hindsight, for example, and you're looking at a past decision and you're thinking, it wasn't the right decision, it took me too long to make it, etc. I would invite you to think about where you are right now and how that justifies the decision that you made in the past. Now, I've used this example on the podcast before of having children, right? And to me, what's so miraculous about children is that they are born. And in order for them to be born, in order for us to be born, there's about a 1 in a trillion chance. There's an actual figure. Somebody's done the math and it's ridiculous. The fact that any of us is on the planet is in defiance of all odds. It really is the confluence of factors, all of which have to line up in order for you to have been the person born, right? To your parents. And so when I look at my kids, I think for them to be who they are, everything in my life had to have happened exactly the way that it happened, to a T, or I wouldn't have these children. Now, maybe I'd have other children. I'd think the same thing about them. But I have the ones that I have. And the way that I think about it is I'm so glad for everything that happened before then, even the stuff that maybe wasn't so easy to go through, because it led me to where I am. And so you might ask yourself how it is that your past decisions have led you to exactly where you are now, even if those decisions may seem like they were bad decisions. Again, it's a label. I'm not saying they are bad decisions. They seemed like bad decisions at the time. Now, you can also do this going forward. If you're looking at your decisions and you're thinking all your options seem really, really awful and you are seeing the potholes and the risks associated with all of them, I'd invite you to also think about how they can be the best decisions, right? What can you learn from these decisions? How is this decision that you're making right now? How is it perfect right now? And how are you the perfect person to make that decision? So again, going back through the process, step 1, stop telling yourself that there are such things as good decisions and bad decisions. Number 2, if you're looking at decisions that you've made in the past in particular, look at all the reasons why something that you may have considered a bad decision was in fact a good decision. Number 3 is to forgive yourself if you need to, right? If you've made a decision in the past and you feel like that was not the best decision, or if there's a decision that you're actively not making, you're deciding not to decide, and you're feeling badly about yourself, right? Why didn't I just do this sooner? The longer that you wait, the harder it seems to make the decision, etc. I would invite you to forgive yourself. Now, what you might do here is to take responsibility for your part of the equation, whether it's the situation that you're in currently, whether it's a decision that you have made. Take responsibility for your part in the decision and whatever consequences followed from making that decision. Now, I would also invite you to notice where your responsibility ends. And you don't need to take responsibility for all of it, because chances are there were other players involved and they would also be responsible for components of the decision. Now, the reason I want you to be really mindful about the level of responsibility that you take here is that I've noticed that for some people, they will assume all responsibility and put the blame all on their shoulders, thinking that they were at fault. It's a decision that they made, they were in the wrong, and they can really layer on the blame. And for other lawyers that I speak with, sometimes they see themselves as not having any responsibility. They really push themselves out of the responsible role, and it almost leans into victimhood, right? That somehow this is all happening. It's beyond their control. They had no role in any of it. It's everybody else's fault and everything around them is bad. And so I think there's room to take on more responsibility. So I'd invite you to think about where you are on that spectrum, right? Are you taking more responsibility than you should be taking on, than is actually truly your responsibility? Or have you stepped away from any responsibility? And what I'd invite you to think about is that for most decisions, there's something in the middle, right? There's some space in the middle where there's parts that you are responsible for, and there's parts that you have no control over. And when it comes to forgiving yourself, what I'm inviting you to do is to own the part of the equation that you are responsible for, and then allow yourself to forgive yourself, right? It's okay. It made sense in that situation that you would make that decision, and you did the best that you could, and you did the best you could in the state that you were in, with the information that you had, with the options that you saw yourself as having, and forgiving yourself. One of the benefits of doing this is not only does it give you a sense of peace and self-forgiveness, it also helps you in terms of future decisions, because it tells you, right? You're telling yourself that even if you were to make another decision that turned out to be a bad decision, that you would be able to forgive yourself for it, right? That you're not going to continue to beat yourself up or call yourself names or tell yourself the story about how you're a bad decision maker. And so that can be really freeing. So that was step 3. And step 4 is to practice making decisions. The way to get good at doing anything is simply to do it on repeat. And if you've been avoiding making decisions, you might find that you've fallen into a default pattern. And we've talked about patterns and habits on the podcast before. I really love to think about how our brains are wired. I love to think about neuroplasticity and how our brains get really good at the things that we do repeatedly. So if we get used to being decision makers, then that will be something that is one of those well-worn neural pathways. We'll continue to get even better at making decisions, versus if we choose not to make decisions, or we see ourselves as bad decision makers and so we avoid it, we're not building up those same pathways, right? We get good at avoiding decisions, letting other people make decisions, etc. And so if you find right now that you're not making decisions, to become a person who does make decisions means that you're going to have to put in quite a bit of work at the beginning, simply to set up a new pathway, to set up a new habit forming. And so what I'd invite you to do is start practicing making decisions. Now, one thing that can be really helpful is if you find that you're fearful of making a decision because it's scary, because there's the potential of it being a bad decision, I'd invite you to go to that worst case scenario and figure out what it is. And I wouldn't even just think about it. I'd actually write it down. I'd give it a list of bullet points. And then I'd ask you to ask yourself what you would do if and when all of those things were to come to fruition. So for example, if you're in a job and you leave that job and you go into a new one and it turns out not to be a very good job, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, chances are you'll go ahead and you will step into a new job. And I've seen this happen with lawyers. I have one lawyer that I worked with who stepped from one role into another role, and within a few months realized this is not the right place, and then went on to make another transition. And it turned out to be the absolute best decision for that person to make. And I think in order to do that, you need to be willing to make a decision, right? And so here, if you think about what the worst case scenario is, yes, maybe you do lose sunk costs. And what do you want to make of that, right? Okay, so you have some sunk costs. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's also true that you've built up a certain level of, if you're looking at a job you've been in, you've built up a certain level of relationships, you've built up a certain skill set, you've built up a certain financial compensation. So there are components of that work that are not sunk costs. And so maybe it's shifting your focus from the sunk cost. Maybe it's accepting, yeah, there is a sunk cost, and there's also a reason to move forward. Maybe it's also fighting back against that initial assumption that it's all sunk costs. So that is step 4, is to simply practice making decisions. And what you might ask yourself to do is to go to that worst case scenario and imagine how you're going to deal with it. So just going back to the 4 steps, number 1 is to let go of this idea that there are good decisions and bad decisions. Number 2 is to look at past decisions and ask yourself how anything that you thought was a bad decision was actually a really good one in the end. Number 3 is to forgive yourself if you need to. And number 4 is to practice making decisions. And if it is helpful or necessary to you, to really give yourself the opportunity to explore worst case scenarios and move on from there. Now, why this is going to work for you, why removing the labels from decisions, is that you will, number 1, stop beating yourself up. If you've been holding yourself back and ruminating over past decisions, you'll get freedom from that, right? Nothing good comes from being unkind to yourself or replaying all the different ways that things could have gone if only you'd made a different decision. This will also free up your energy, right? The energy you're not spending regretting the past is energy that you now have that you can use to move forward. You'll also find that you untangle yourself from all or nothing thinking, right? If you are looking at decisions as binary, right? It's a good decision or it's a bad decision. You might find that you're really trapped in black or white thinking. And black and white thinking can be quite pervasive. It shows up a lot with procrastination. You may look at 2 different paths and you think, well, either it has to be perfect or I'm not going to do it at all. So you're trapped in black or white thinking. So you may kind of be halfway through your workday and you've got a big project that you want to work on. And you think, well, I can't get all of it done. So I'm just not going to start at all. And so you push it off and you push it off and you push it off. So if you're looking at the world with a very black and white lens, then you might find that it's influencing your ability to make decisions, and it might be showing up in other places as well. So this is one way where you might start to chip away at that black and white thinking, because you're able to see within decisions that yes, there's some good and there's some bad, that really everything is a mix of both. Another thing that will happen is you'll rebuild your ability to trust yourself. And so if you are able to trust yourself to make decisions, period, and that if a decision turns out to be one where the expectations are not met, right? It could be what you might consider a bad decision. And yet you know that you are absolutely capable of recovering from a decision that doesn't go your way. Then you'll build that trust with yourself to make decisions and to take care of yourself no matter how that decision unfolds. And to do this, you'll need a few skills. Number 1 is it may require quite a bit of discipline at the beginning, right? If you need to rewire the way that you think about decisions, that will take energy and effort and discipline and focus. And it may be hard to change your way of thinking, especially if you're used to thinking a certain way, right? If you're used to labeling decisions as good and bad, if you're used to being fearful of bad decisions, then this may be a big mindset shift for you, and it might be one that takes some time to stick. You'll also need to draw on your courage to be a decision maker or to become a decision maker. It might be hard if you're taking responsibility for decisions and you're used to letting others make those decisions for you. It may take a lot of courage, especially at first, to own those decisions. It will also require a willingness to stop blaming yourself and talking yourself out of making decisions. So if you are letting this idea of a bad decision keep you stuck, at a very unconscious level, it's also keeping you safe. It's keeping you from having to change anything in your environment because you're not making that decision. And so when you decide to finally move ahead, right, and stop blaming yourself and stop talking yourself out of making decisions, then you're going to find that you are less stuck. And it can be exciting to move forward. It can also be a little bit scary. And when you do all of these things, what you might find is that there's a lot less fear around decisions, right? There's a lot less fear. You start to make more decisions. You start to move faster. So maybe you make a decision. It's not exactly what you wanted, but then you can course correct, right? You have a decision to have a discussion with your employer. You have a discussion with the person who reports to you. And maybe that decision is a difficult conversation and the outcome is really great and you're super happy and problems are all solved, or maybe not. right? Maybe you actually learn that your employer isn't that happy with you either. Maybe you learn that the person that you are relying on to help you isn't that engaged in the process or isn't capable of helping you. And so it might feel like you made a decision and you took action and it wasn't the outcome that you wanted, but chances are it's information that is helpful to you to move forward for your next move. What you might also find then is that you're moving faster and you're building your confidence because you're now making more decisions. You're seeing how those decisions turn out. You're able to course correct if you need to. And what you'll find is that you're learning to trust yourself again, right? You start to see yourself as a decision maker. You start to see how you're actually pretty good at making good decisions, right? Or decisions that have an outcome that you desire. And what you might also find is that as you do this, you start reconnecting with your instincts, right? As you practice, as you make more decisions, you might start to notice more and more where that gut starts to speak to you, right? You're making a decision and your gut speaks up and you follow it or you don't follow it. And then you get to see the consequences of that, right? The positive and the negative. So, my dear friend, thank you for joining me on this week's podcast episode. I really hope that today's discussion has given you something to think about when it comes to decisions, and that whatever decisions are lying ahead of you that you want to make, right? That you've now got a different framework in terms of how to look at that decision. And if you've got decisions from the past where you're still kind of cringing about it, you still haven't quite forgiven yourself, that you've now got some tools that you can use to let those decisions, those past decisions, go in peace and to free yourself moving forward from this notion of bad decisions. So thank you again for joining me. Again, if any of you has any questions, right? If you wanted to talk to me about a situation that you're in, a decision that you need to make, I would absolutely love to hear from you. I continue to work one-to-one with my coaching clients, and I also offer groups. And so I think you can keep an eye out for that. I'm thinking about what that's going to look like. And so stay tuned. And for any of you who are enjoying this podcast, please do share it with a friend. Please do give it a rating and review. I would love for everyone who would love to have access to this type of information to have that access. And so you can help make that happen by sharing it, by giving it a review and making it known to others. So with that, I wanted to thank you again and wish you a beautiful week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.